The morning of September 14th, 2022, brought an unusual stillness to London. As dawn broke over the Thames, millions of people around the world held their breath. Queen Elizabeth II, who had ruled Britain for 70 years, was about to begin her final journey through the capital she had served for most of her life. The Queen's coffin had arrived at Buckingham Palace the previous evening, carried from Scotland, where she had died peacefully at Balmoral Castle on September 8th. Now, wrapped in the royal standard and topped with the imperial state crown, her remains would travel from the palace to Westminster Hall, where she would lie in state for 4 days before her funeral. At exactly 2:22 p.m., the doors of Buckingham Palace opened. 8 soldiers from the Queen's Company, 1st Battalion Grenadier Guards, emerged carrying the oak coffin. Behind them walked King Charles III, dressed in military uniform, his face showing the weight of both grief and the enormous responsibility now resting on his shoulders. The new king had barely had time to process his mother's death before being thrust into the spotlight of his new role. Princess and the Queen's only daughter walked beside her brother. Known for her no-nonsense approach and deep devotion to royal duty, she had stayed by her mother's side during the final days at Balmoral. Prince Andrew and Prince Edward, the Queen's younger sons, followed behind, their faces reflecting the shock that still gripped the nation. The procession moved slowly through the palace gates and onto the Mall. Thousands of people lined the streets, many having camped overnight to secure the best viewing spots. Some held flowers, others clutched photographs of the Queen taken during her many decades of public service. Children sat on their parents' shoulders, witnessing a piece of history that would be talked about for generations. The silence was remarkable. In a city known for its bustling traffic and constant noise, London had fallen completely quiet. The only sounds were the steady beat of drums, the clip-clop of horses' hooves on asphalt, and the occasional sob from someone in the crowd who could no longer contain their emotions. The bearer party moved with practiced precision, each step carefully measured. These 8 men had trained for this moment, though none had imagined it would come so soon. The Queen's death at age 96 had not been entirely unexpected, but when it finally happened, it still felt sudden. She had been carrying out official duties just days before her death, meeting with the new Prime Minister Liz Truss at Balmoral. As the procession turned onto Whitehall, the full majesty of the moment became clear. The coffin was placed on a gun carriage, an honor reserved for monarchs and the most distinguished military leaders. The King's Troop Royal Horse Artillery provided the horses, their black funeral decorations creating a stark contrast against their usually bright ceremonial gear. Behind the immediate royal family walked other members of the House of Windsor. Prince William, now the heir to the throne, moved with the same measured dignity he had shown at his mother Princess Diana's funeral 25 years earlier. Prince Harry, despite the recent tensions within the family, had flown from California to be present for his grandmother's final farewell. The relationship between the two brothers had been strained in recent years, particularly after Harry and his wife Meghan stepped back from royal duties and moved to America. Their explosive interview with Oprah Winfrey had sent shockwaves through the monarchy, with allegations of racism and lack of support from Meghan's mental health struggles. Yet today, personal differences were set aside. The Queen, who had always prioritized duty above personal feelings, would have expected nothing less. The procession route took 42 minutes to complete. Every step was watched by cameras broadcasting to billions of people worldwide. In Australia, Canada, New Zealand, and the other Commonwealth realms where Elizabeth had also been queen, people gathered around televisions and computer screens. In some countries, it was the middle of the night, but that didn't stop mourners from staying awake to witness this historic moment. Westminster Hall, the destination of this solemn journey, had been prepared for weeks. The medieval hall, with its magnificent hammer-beam roof, had hosted many significant events in British history. Kings and queens had lain in state here before, but never in the modern television age when every detail would be scrutinized by a global audience. The hall had been transformed into what officials called a place of pilgrimage. Massive floodlights illuminated the ancient walls, while barriers and security checkpoints had been erected outside to manage the expected crowds. Palace officials estimated that up to 1 million people might attempt to pay their respects during the 4-day lying in state period. As the gun carriage approached Westminster, the crowds grew even thicker. People had come from all corners of the United Kingdom and beyond. Many were elderly, having lived through the Queen's entire reign and feeling a personal connection to the monarch who had been a constant presence in their lives. Others were young families, wanting their children to witness this moment in history. The bearer party lifted the coffin from the gun carriage and carried it up the steps into Westminster Hall. Inside, a small group of officials, clergy, and family members waited. The Archbishop of Canterbury, Justin Welby, conducted a brief service. His words were simple but profound, reflecting on a life devoted to service and duty. "Here lies a servant of God and of her people," the Archbishop intoned. "May she rest in peace and rise in glory." The coffin was placed on a raised platform called a catafalque in the center of the hall. For candles were lit at each corner, their flames providing the only moving elements in an otherwise perfectly still scene. The imperial state crown, containing nearly 3,000 diamonds, sat atop the coffin, catching the light and creating small rainbows on the ancient walls. The vigil of the princes would begin later, with members of the royal family taking turns to stand guard over their mother and grandmother. This ancient tradition would see the new king and his siblings standing motionless for 15 minutes at a time, their heads bowed in respect. But first, the doors would open to the public. The queue was already forming, stretching along the south bank of the Thames. These first mourners had been waiting for hours, some since the previous evening. They came from all walks of life, teachers and doctors, factory workers and business executives, teenagers and grandparents united by their desire to say goodbye to the Queen. The lying in state represented something unique in modern life. In an age of instant communication and constant change, here was a moment that demanded patience and reflection. People would wait for hours, sometimes more than 12, for just a few seconds in the presence of the Queen's coffin. No photographs were allowed. No phones could be used inside the hall. It was a purely human experience, stripped of the digital distractions that dominated daily life. The first members of the public entered Westminster Hall at 5 p.m. They walked slowly, reverently, many with tears in their eyes. Some bowed their heads, others curtsied or bowed. A few whispered quiet prayers or words of thanks for the Queen's lifetime of service. The atmosphere was electric with emotion, yet peaceful in a way that surprised even seasoned royal watchers. Among the early visitors was a woman named Margaret Thompson, aged 84, who had driven from Scotland with her granddaughter. "I had to come," she explained to reporters outside. "She was my queen for my entire adult life. She never let us down, not once." Behind her in the queue was David Chun, a young father who had brought his 8-year-old daughter. "I want her to remember this," he said, holding his child's hand tightly. "History is happening right here, right now." The diversity of the mourners reflected modern Britain in all its complexity. There were people whose families had lived in the country for centuries, and others who had arrived more recently, drawn by Britain's opportunities and values. All felt a connection to the Queen, who had somehow managed to represent both tradition and progress, continuity and change. As night fell over London, the queue continued to grow. Television news anchors struggled to find words adequate to describe what they were witnessing. This was not just about mourning a death. It was about the end of an era. The Queen had been the thread connecting modern Britain to its past, a living link to a time when the country was a global superpower and deference to authority was unquestioned. Her reign had spanned an extraordinary period of change. She had come to the throne when Britain still had an empire, when most homes didn't have televisions, when social media was unimaginable. She had adapted to each new era while maintaining the dignity and mystery that made the monarchy special. Now, with her death, Britain was forced to confront questions about its future that had been postponed for 70 years. The lying in state would continue for 4 full days, 24 hours a day. The queue would snake through London, becoming a phenomenon in itself. People would share food and stories, form friendships that would last beyond the funeral, and create a temporary community bound together by shared respect for their departed queen. In Westminster Hall, the vigil continued through the night. The 4 candles flickered, but never went out, watched over by guards who stood motionless as statues. The crown caught the light from different angles as the hours passed, creating an ever-changing display of brilliance that seemed to symbolize the many facets of the Queen's remarkable life. Outside, London slept fitfully, preparing for 3 more days of mourning, reflection, and ultimately celebration of a life that had touched millions of people around the world. The Queen was lying in state, but her legacy was very much alive in the hearts and minds of all who had been privileged to call her their sovereign. By dawn on September 15th, the queue to see Queen Elizabeth II lying in state had grown beyond anyone's expectations. What had started as a line of a few hundred dedicated mourners had become a human river flowing through the heart of London. Officials estimated that over 100,000 people were already waiting, with thousands more arriving every hour. The queue began at Southwark Park, wound its way along the Thames, crossed Lambeth Bridge, and ended at Westminster Hall. The total distance was over 5 miles, but the line moved so slowly that wait times had already reached 8 hours. Yet nobody seemed to mind. There was something extraordinary happening here, something that went beyond the usual British experience of queuing. Sarah Mitchell, a nurse from Manchester, had arrived at 3 a.m. with her teenage daughter Emma. They had driven through the night, leaving home immediately after Sarah finished her shift at the hospital. "I delivered babies on the day the Queen died," Sarah told a fellow carer. "It felt wrong somehow, bringing new life into the world on the day she left it. I needed to be here to say goodbye properly." The queue had developed its own culture and etiquette. People saved places for each other when bathroom breaks were needed. Strangers shared sandwiches, coffee, and stories. Someone had started a WhatsApp group called The Queue that had already grown to over 1,000 members, sharing updates about wait times, weather conditions, and the location of the nearest facilities. Behind Sarah and Emma stood Professor James Wright, a historian from Cambridge who had studied the monarchy for 40 years. He found himself explaining constitutional details to anyone who would listen, his academic enthusiasm infectious even in the somber circumstances. "This is living history," he kept saying, his eyes bright with excitement despite the sad occasion. "Future generations will study this moment, try to understand what made people wait so long just to spend a few seconds in her presence." The atmosphere was unlike anything London had ever seen. Despite the grief and the long wait, there was a strange sense of celebration. People wore their smartest clothes, as if they were going to meet the Queen personally. Many carried flowers, photographs, or small mementos. One elderly man clutched a program from the Queen's coronation in 1953, yellowed with age, but carefully preserved for nearly 70 years. The queue was truly democratic. Wealthy business people stood behind unemployed teenagers. Famous actors waited alongside factory workers, and nobody complained about the lack of special treatment. This was perhaps the most British thing imaginable. An orderly line where everyone was equal, where patience was a virtue, and where good manners prevailed despite the circumstances. Food vendors had appeared along the route, but many were giving away free tea and sandwiches rather than selling them. The spirit of community was overwhelming. When rain began to fall around midday, umbrellas magically appeared from nowhere, shared between strangers who had met just hours before. Among those waiting was Fatima al-Hassan, who had immigrated to Britain from Syria 5 years earlier. She spoke broken English, but had no trouble communicating her feelings about the Queen. "She welcomed me," Fatima said, tears in her eyes. "When I come here, scared, no English, she is my Queen too." Fair to everyone. The stories in the queue were endless and fascinating. There was the World War II veteran who remembered the then Princess Elizabeth visiting his unit in 1945. the teacher who had taken her class to wave at the Queen during a royal visit 20 years ago. The young mother whose own mother had died just weeks before the Queen, making this pilgrimage feel like saying goodbye to both. Television crews moved up and down the line, interviewing mourners, but they found it almost impossible to capture the full scope of what was happening. This wasn't just about one old lady who had died. It was about the end of the longest reign in British history, the closing of a chapter that had lasted longer than most people's entire lives. The queue had its own rhythm and flow. People moved forward in bursts, sometimes walking quickly for several minutes, then standing still for an hour or more. Veterans organized themselves into informal groups, sharing military stories and memories of royal visits to their units. Families played quiet games to keep children entertained. Book clubs, church groups, and friends who had traveled together found ways to pass the time. Technology played an interesting role. While phones couldn't be used inside Westminster Hall, the queue itself became a social media phenomenon. People posted photos of the endless line, shared updates on wait times, and created hashtags that trended worldwide. The most popular was #TheQueue, which became a symbol of British resilience and dedication. Security was tight, but mostly invisible. Police officers mingled with the crowd in plain clothes, watching for potential troublemakers or safety issues. Metal detectors had been set up at several checkpoints, but the process was remarkably smooth considering the numbers involved. The British public's natural sense of order and respect for authority helped maintain peaceful conditions throughout. As the day progressed, the queue became a destination in itself. People came just to walk alongside it, offering support to the waiting mourners. Volunteers appeared with folding chairs for elderly queers, blankets for those who hadn't dressed warmly enough, and water bottles for anyone who needed them. London showed its best face to the world during these extraordinary days. The diversity of the mourners reflected the multicultural reality of modern Britain. There were people who had been born when the Queen came to the throne in 1952, and others who had arrived in the country just months before her death. Yet all felt a connection to the monarch who had somehow managed to represent unity in an increasingly divided world. One of the most moving encounters involved two elderly women who discovered they had both worked at Buckingham Palace, but 50 years apart. Margaret had been a housemaid in the 1960s, while Joyce had worked in the kitchen during the 1990s. They spent hours comparing their memories of palace life, finding common ground in their shared respect for the Queen's dedication and kindness. The Queen had always been known for her attention to detail and her ability to make people feel special during brief encounters. These qualities were reflected in the mourners' stories. A firefighter remembered how she had asked specific questions about his work during a ceremony. A schoolchild recalled how the Queen had bent down to speak to her directly, making her feel like the most important person in the world for those few seconds. As evening approached, the queue showed no signs of shrinking. If anything, it was growing longer as people finished work and joined the pilgrimage. The government had set up a sophisticated system to track wait times and manage the flow of people, but even their most pessimistic estimates were being exceeded. Inside Westminster Hall, the vigil continued unchanged. The Queen lay in state surrounded by the golden glow of candlelight, her crown catching and reflecting the flames in patterns that seemed to dance across the ancient walls. The yeoman warders, known as beefeaters, maintained their silent watch, changing guard every 20 minutes with ceremonies that had remained unchanged for centuries. The 4 days of lying in state had been chosen deliberately to allow as many people as possible to pay their respects. Officials had studied previous royal funerals and lying in state ceremonies, but nothing in history compared to the scale of public response to Queen Elizabeth II's death. The Queen Mother's lying in state in 2002 had attracted 200,000 visitors over 4 days. Current estimates suggested this figure would be exceeded within the first 48 hours. International visitors were arriving in increasing numbers. Many had flown to London specifically to join the queue, treating it as a once-in-a-lifetime pilgrimage. A group of Canadian nurses had pooled their money to buy last-minute flights. A family from New Zealand had changed their holiday plans to include this unexpected detour. Commonwealth citizens felt a special connection to the Queen, who had also been their head of state. The queue also attracted some famous faces, though most tried to remain inconspicuous. Celebrities who attempted to jump the line faced fierce criticism on social media, reinforcing the democratic nature of the event. When soccer star David Beckham joined the queue like everyone else and waited for over 12 hours, he was praised for showing proper respect and humility. Local businesses along the queue route found themselves dealing with an unprecedented situation. Cafes that normally served a few dozen customers per day were suddenly facing thousands of potential visitors. Many stayed open 24 hours, their staff working extra shifts to help support the mourners. The economic impact was significant, but most business owners seemed more interested in being part of history than making quick profits. The media struggled to find adequate ways to describe what was happening. International reporters, and used to British customs, and the concept of queuing as a national character trait, found themselves genuinely puzzled by the public response. How could people wait so long for such a brief experience? What drove this extraordinary display of patience and dedication? The answer lay in the unique relationship between the British people and their Queen. For 70 years, she had been a constant presence in their lives, appearing on their money, their stamps, and their television screens. She had been there during the great moments of celebration and the darkest hours of crisis. Her Christmas broadcasts had become as much a part of the holiday tradition as turkey and presents. As night fell on the second day of lying in state, the queue stretched further than ever before. Estimates suggested that over 250,000 people had already paid their respects, with many thousands more still waiting their turn. The logistical challenge was enormous, but somehow the system was working. The British talent for organization and the public's willingness to follow rules had created a moving tribute to their departed queen. The queue continued through the night, lit by street lights and the glow of smartphone screens. People dozed while standing, leaning against railings or each other for support. Volunteers distributed blankets and hot drinks. Police officers chatted quietly with mourners, sharing their own memories of royal encounters. In Westminster Hall, the eternal flame of the 4 candles continued to burn, watched over by guards who had trained for this moment their entire careers. The Queen rested in state, surrounded by symbols of the history and tradition she had embodied for so long. Outside, her people maintained their vigil, creating their own piece of history in the simple act of waiting to say goodbye. As the third day of lying in state dawned, Westminster Hall had become the most watched building in the world. Inside the ancient walls, a tradition older than many nations continued with clockwork precision. Every 20 minutes, the guard changed with ceremonies that had remained virtually unchanged for hundreds of years. The yeoman warders, resplendent in their Tudor uniforms, moved with practiced grace around the Queen's coffin. But it was the royal vigils that captured the world's attention most powerfully. The tradition of the Vigil of the Princes dates back centuries, where male members of the royal family stand guard over their deceased monarch. However, in keeping with the Queen's lifelong commitment to equality and modernization, the tradition was expanded to include Princess and the Queen's daughter. King Charles III had stood the first vigil on the evening of September 15th. Dressed in the uniform of the Welsh Guards, he took his position at the head of the coffin, his head bowed in silent prayer. For 15 minutes, he stood perfectly still, the weight of his new responsibilities visible in every line of his body. The crown he would soon wear felt heavy even in its absence. The new king's thoughts during those 15 minutes would forever remain private, but those who observed him spoke of the profound dignity he displayed. This was a man saying goodbye to his mother while simultaneously accepting the burden of kingship. The two roles, son and sovereign, merged in those quiet moments under the ancient hammerbeam roof. Princess Anne's vigil came next, and it was perhaps the most emotionally powerful of all. Known throughout her life for her no-nonsense approach and unwavering dedication to duty, She had been closest to the Queen in temperament and work ethic. As she stood guard over her mother's coffin, many observers noted the striking resemblance between mother and daughter, not just in appearance, but in the steely determination that had made both women so effective in their royal roles. The Princess Royal had accompanied her mother's coffin on its journey from Scotland, riding in the car behind the hearse for the 6-hour drive from Balmoral to Edinburgh. She had not left her mother's side since the Queen's death, taking personal responsibility for ensuring that every detail of the arrangements reflected the dignity and respect that Elizabeth II deserved. Prince Andrew and Prince Edward, the Queen's younger sons, also took their turns at the vigil. For Andrew, it was a poignant moment of redemption. His association with Jeffrey Epstein had damaged his reputation and forced him to step back from public duties. But here, in the presence of his mother's coffin, he was simply a son mourning his loss. The controversy and scandal seemed irrelevant in the face of such personal grief. Prince Edward, the youngest of the Queen's children, had always been considered the most private member of the family. His vigil was marked by quiet emotion that many found deeply moving. As the Earl of Wessex, he had carried out hundreds of royal engagements over the years, but always somewhat in the shadow of his more prominent siblings. Now, standing guard over his mother, he represented the dedication and service that characterized the entire royal family. The grandchildren's vigil was scheduled for the evening of September 16th. Prince William, now heir to the throne, would lead his cousins in a ceremony that symbolized the passing of responsibility to a new generation. The arrangements had required delicate negotiation, particularly regarding Prince Harry's participation. Harry's relationship with the royal family had been strained since his decision to step back from official duties and move to California with his wife Meghan. Their explosive interview with Oprah Winfrey had accused the royal family of racism and lack of support, creating rifts that had barely begun to heal. Yet in death, the Queen's wish for family unity prevailed over personal disagreements. The brothers, William and Harry, had not spoken privately since their brief reunion at Prince Philip's funeral the previous year. But, as they prepared to stand vigil together over their grandmother's coffin, old wounds seemed less important than shared grief and respect for the woman who had shaped both their lives. Prince William's preparation for the vigil was particularly significant. As the new Prince of Wales and heir to the throne, he carried the burden of representing continuity with his grandmother's reign, while also symbolizing the monarchy's future. His military uniform, that of the Welsh Guards, connected him to centuries of royal tradition, while his composed demeanor reflected the modern, accessible style of monarchy he intended to represent. The other cousins participating in the vigil each brought their own stories and significance. Peter Phillips, princess and son, had always maintained a relatively private life despite his royal connections. His presence at the vigil represented the Queen's commitment to family over titles and formality. Zara Tindall, also Princess Anne's daughter, had followed her mother's example of combining royal duty with personal achievement, becoming an Olympic equestrian while fulfilling her royal obligations. Lady Louise Windsor and James, Earl of Wessex, the teenage children of Prince Edward, would also participate in a modified version of the vigil. Their youth made them symbols of the monarchy's future, carrying forward their grandmother's legacy into a world she could barely have imagined when she became queen in 1952. Behind the scenes, the logistics of organizing these vigils were extraordinarily complex. Each participant required specific military uniforms, which had to be fitted and prepared perfectly. The timing had to be coordinated with the public viewing schedule, security arrangements, and media coverage. Palace officials worked around the clock to ensure that every detail honored both tradition and the Queen's personal wishes. The Queen had been intimately involved in planning her own funeral arrangements for many years. Operation London Bridge, as the plans were known, had been updated regularly to reflect her changing preferences and the evolving nature of the monarchy. She had specifically requested that the lying in state should be accessible to as many people as possible, leading to the decision to keep Westminster Hall open 24 hours a day. The choice of Westminster Hall itself was deeply significant. This was where Charles I had been tried and condemned to death in 1649, ending the first period of absolute monarchy in England. It was also where Winston Churchill had lain in state in 1965, honoring the man who had led Britain through its darkest hour. By choosing this location, the Queen connected her death to the great moments of constitutional and political history that had shaped modern Britain. The medieval hall had required extensive modifications to accommodate the lying in state. Structural engineers had assessed the building's ability to handle the weight of thousands of visitors per hour. Lighting specialists had created the perfect balance of illumination to highlight the coffin while maintaining the solemn atmosphere. Security experts had installed invisible systems to protect both the royal family and the public without disrupting the dignity of the occasion. One of the most moving aspects of the vigils was the diversity of uniforms worn by the royal family members. Each outfit told a story of service and dedication. King Charles wore the uniform of the Welsh Guards, reflecting his long association with Wales as Prince of Wales. Princess Anne wore the uniform of the Royal Navy, honoring her role as Admiral and Chief Commandant. The military connections emphasized the Queen's role as Supreme Commander of the Armed Forces, a responsibility that had weighed heavily on her throughout her reign. The public response to the vigils was overwhelming. Television audiences reached record levels as people around the world tuned in to witness these intimate family moments. Social media was filled with messages of support and admiration for the royal family's dignity in the face of grief. Even Republicans who opposed the monarchy found themselves moved by the human elements of loss and remembrance. International media struggled to explain the significance of the vigils to audiences unfamiliar with British traditions. The concept of standing motionless for 15 minutes as a mark of respect seemed alien in cultures that expressed grief more demonstratively. Yet the power of the image, young and old members of the royal family united in silent tribute, transcended cultural boundaries. The vigils also highlighted the military traditions that were so important to the Queen throughout her life. She had served as a mechanic and driver during World War II, one of the few experiences that had given her insight into ordinary people's lives. Her respect for the armed forces was reflected in her many military patronages and her insistence that royal family members serve in the military before taking on full-time royal duties. As each vigil concluded, the participants left Westminster Hall with visible emotion. The experience of standing guard over the Queen's coffin clearly affected everyone involved, from the new king to the youngest grandchildren. These were not just formal ceremonies, but deeply personal moments of farewell to a woman who had been the center of their family for decades. The vigils continued around the clock, with professional guards maintaining watch between the royal family appearances. The household division, whose soldiers had protected the Queen throughout her reign, took particular pride in this final duty. Many of the guards had met the Queen personally during her regular visits to military bases and ceremonies. For them, this was not just a professional obligation, but a personal honor. Westminster Hall itself seemed to absorb the significance of these moments. The ancient building had witnessed centuries of British history, from medieval parliaments to modern state occasions. The lying in state of Queen Elizabeth II added another chapter to this remarkable story, connecting contemporary Britain to its historical roots while demonstrating the continuing relevance of constitutional monarchy in the 21st century. Outside the hall, the queue continued to grow. People who had witnessed the royal vigils on television were inspired to join the pilgrimage themselves. The combination of public accessibility and royal tradition created a unique democratic moment in British history, where ordinary citizens could participate in the same ceremony as kings and princes, united by shared respect for their departed queen. By the fourth day of lying in state, it had become clear that Queen Elizabeth II's death was being mourned on a scale unprecedented in modern history. The queue in London had become a global phenomenon, but the grief and respect being shown extended far beyond Britain's borders. In every corner of the Commonwealth and beyond, people were finding their own ways to say goodbye to the monarch who had reigned for longer than most had been alive. In Canada, where the Queen had been head of state for over 70 years, Parliament Hill in Ottawa became an impromptu shrine. Thousands of flowers, letters, and photographs were left at the gates, creating a carpet of color and memory. Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, whose own father Pierre had developed a complex but ultimately respectful relationship with the Queen, spoke for many Canadians when he described feeling orphaned by her death. The constitutional implications of the Queen's death were being felt most acutely in the Commonwealth realms, where she had served as head of state. In Australia, where Republican sentiment had been growing for decades, the transition to King Charles III proceeded smoothly, but not without emotional complexity. Many Australians who had opposed the monarchy in principle found themselves unexpectedly moved by the Queen's death, recognizing her personal qualities even if they questioned the institution she represented. New Zealand's response was particularly poignant. The country that had perhaps the most affectionate relationship with the Queen in recent decades saw an outpouring of grief that surprised even local officials. Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern, known for her progressive politics, spoke movingly about the Queen's grace, calmness, and dignity, and declared a public holiday for the funeral. In the Caribbean nations where the Queen had also reigned, the response was more complex. Countries like Jamaica and Barbados, which had recently become republics or were considering doing so, found themselves grappling with mixed emotions. The Queen's death forced a reckoning with colonial history while also acknowledging her personal efforts to modernize the monarchy and address historical wrongs. The constitutional mechanics of succession were proceeding flawlessly, testament to centuries of legal and practical preparation. In every Commonwealth realm, Charles had automatically become king the moment his mother died, with no gap in monarchical authority. Proclamations were read in capital cities around the world, ancient ceremonies adapted for modern media coverage. But beyond the constitutional formalities, the Queen's death had triggered something deeper, a global conversation about duty, service, and the role of tradition in a rapidly changing world. Her 70-year reign had spanned an extraordinary period of transformation. When she became queen in 1952, Britain still ruled a global empire. Most homes lacked televisions, and social media was unimaginable. She had adapted to each era while maintaining the essential dignity that made the monarchy special. The lying in state had become a focal point for this broader reflection. Inside Westminster Hall, representatives from 195 countries had come to pay their respects. Presidents and prime ministers, kings and emperors, religious leaders, and Nobel laureates form an unprecedented gathering of global leadership. The guest list read like a who's who of world politics and society. President Biden of the United States had arrived with a large delegation, reflecting the special relationship between Britain and America that the Queen had nurtured through 14 different U.S. presidents. His presence was particularly significant given his Irish Catholic background and his party's traditionally Republican sympathies. Yet Biden spoke warmly of the Queen's grace and wisdom during their meetings. French President Emmanuel Macron, representing a nation that had once been Britain's greatest rival, praised the Queen's role in European reconciliation after World War II. German Chancellor Olaf Scholz emphasized her contribution to healing the wounds between former enemies. Even leaders of countries that had fought Britain during decolonization acknowledged her efforts to transform the Commonwealth from an imperial relic into a voluntary association of sovereign nations. The cue to see the Queen lying in state had taken on almost mythical status. By the morning of September 17th, over 400,000 people had filed past the coffin, with wait times reaching 12 hours. The diversity of mourners continued to amaze observers. Celebrities mixed with factory workers, elderly veterans stood alongside young families, and people from every background and belief system united in their desire to pay respects. Among the most touching visits were those from Commonwealth citizens who had traveled thousands of miles to be present. A group of Maori elders from New Zealand had performed a traditional haka outside Westminster Hall, their powerful chant echoing off the ancient walls. Canadian First Nations leaders had brought sacred tobacco to leave as an offering, reflecting Indigenous traditions while honoring the Crown's complex relationship with Native peoples. The Queen's long relationship with the Commonwealth had been one of her greatest achievements and source of personal satisfaction. She had transformed the organization from a collection of former colonies into a voluntary partnership of equals. Her annual Commonwealth Day broadcasts had reached billions of people, and her personal friendships with Commonwealth leaders had often transcended political differences. The lying in state was also revealing unexpected aspects of the Queen's influence on popular culture. Musicians, artists, and writers from around the world have been inspired by her example of duty and service. The Sex Pistols' God Save the Queen, once seen as the ultimate anti-establishment anthem, was being reinterpreted by some as a complex tribute to British resilience and character. Social media had created a global conversation about the Queen's legacy that transcended traditional boundaries. Young people who had grown up in Republican nations found themselves surprisingly moved by her death. Memes and tributes appeared in dozens of languages, many focusing on the Queen's wit, her love of animals, and her ability to remain relevant across multiple generations. The queue itself had become a sociological phenomenon worthy of academic study. Researchers were documenting the spontaneous communities that formed among waiting mourners, the sharing of food and stories, and the breakdown of normal social barriers. In an age of digital isolation, the queue represented something powerfully analog, people coming together in physical space for a shared emotional experience. Technology played a fascinating role in the lying in state period. While phones and cameras were banned inside Westminster Hall, the queue was constantly connected to social media. People shared updates on wait times, weather conditions, and emotional moments. The hashtag the queue became a global trending topic, used by people around the world to share their own memories and tributes to the Queen. The economic impact of the lying in state was substantial, but largely ignored in favor of its emotional significance. Hotels in London were completely booked, restaurants stayed open around the clock, and transport systems operated special services to handle the unprecedented crowds. Yet most businesses seemed more interested in being part of history than making quick profits. The security operation was one of the largest ever mounted in peacetime Britain. Thousands of police officers from across the country had been deployed to London, working alongside military units and intelligence services to ensure public safety. The fact that such massive crowds could gather peacefully was itself a tribute to British civic culture and the respect felt for the Queen. International media coverage had transformed Westminster Hall into the most watched building on Earth. News channels provided continuous coverage, with expert commentators explaining British traditions to global audiences. The images of the Queen lying in state, surrounded by the golden glow of candles and the magnificent medieval architecture, became iconic representations of her reign's end. Religious leaders from all faiths had found common ground in praising the Queen's example of service and duty. The Archbishop of Canterbury's prayers were echoed by Islamic imams, Jewish rabbis, Hindu priests, and Buddhist monks. The Queen's commitment to religious tolerance and interfaith dialogue had made her a respected figure across religious boundaries. The constitutional scholars were having a field day analyzing the transition from Elizabeth II to Charles III. The seamless transfer of power demonstrated the stability of the British system, but also highlighted questions about the monarchy's future role. Charles would inherit a very different world from the one his mother had known as a young queen, and his approach to the role would inevitably reflect these changed circumstances. As the fourth day drew to a close, preparations for the funeral were intensifying. Westminster Hall would close to the public at 6:30 a.m. on September 19th, allowing time for final preparations before the service at Westminster Abbey. The lying in state had exceeded all expectations, with over 500,000 people having paid their respects and millions more watching the coverage worldwide. The Queen's lying in state had become more than a formal ceremony. It was a moment of collective catharsis for a nation and Commonwealth coming to terms with the end of an era. The 4 days had allowed people from all walks of life to participate in marking the end of the longest reign in British history, creating memories that would be passed down through generations. In Westminster Hall, the eternal flames continued to burn as they had for 4 days and nights. The Queen rested in state surrounded by symbols of the tradition and continuity she had embodied throughout her remarkable life. Soon, she would make her final journey to Windsor Castle, but the impact of these 4 extraordinary days would resonate far beyond her funeral. At 6:30 a.m. on September 19th, 2022, the doors of Westminster Hall closed to the public for the final time. The last mourners to view Queen Elizabeth II lying in state were a group of volunteers who had helped manage the queue throughout the 4 extraordinary days. It seemed fitting that these ordinary citizens, who had embodied the spirit of service that the Queen herself had represented, should be the final witnesses to this historic vigil. The statistics were staggering. Over the 4 days and nights, more than 750,000 people had filed past the Queen's coffin. The queue had stretched as long as 10 miles at its peak, with wait times reaching 14 hours. Yet complaints had been virtually non-existent. The British public had demonstrated a capacity for patience and dignity that surprised even seasoned royal watchers. Sarah Mitchell, the nurse from Manchester who had arrived in the early hours of September 15th, had returned to London to witness the funeral. She stood among thousands of others lining the processional route, reflecting on how the experience of the queue had changed her understanding of her country and its people. "I met more strangers in those 14 hours than I had in years," she told a reporter. And every single one of them had a story about what the Queen meant to them. Inside Westminster Hall, the final preparations for moving the Queen's coffin were underway. The bearer party from the Queen's Company, 1st Battalion Grenadier Guards, had practiced this moment countless times, but the reality of lifting the coffin for its final journey was emotionally overwhelming. These 8 soldiers had stood guard over their commander-in-chief for 4 days, and now they would carry her to her final resting place. The imperial state crown was carefully removed from the coffin by the crown jeweler, Mark Appleby, whose family had served the crown for generations. The crown, containing nearly 3,000 diamonds, would travel separately to Westminster Abbey and then to Windsor Castle. For 4 days, it had caught the light of the eternal flames, creating patterns of brilliance that seemed to symbolize the many facets of the Queen's remarkable reign. At exactly 10:44 a.m., the bearer party lifted the coffin and began the short procession to Westminster Abbey. The same route that had brought the Queen to Westminster Hall 4 days earlier now carried her toward her funeral service and final journey to Windsor. But everything had changed in those intervening days. The Queen's lying in state had transformed public mourning from a private grief into a collective celebration of a life devoted to service. King Charles III walked behind the coffin once again, but now he was no longer just a grieving son. The 4 days of lying in state had given the nation time to adjust to his kingship, to see him fulfilling the same duties of respect and dignity that his mother had embodied throughout her reign. The constitutional transition was complete, but the emotional journey was still continuing. Princess Anne, who had maintained such composure throughout the entire period, allowed herself a brief moment of visible emotion as the coffin passed the crowds lining the street. She had been her mother's closest companion in the final years, accompanying her to countless engagements and providing the steady support that had allowed the Queen to continue working almost until the day she died. The crowds lining the route to Westminster Abbey were different from those who had queued to see the lying in state. These were people who had come to witness history rather than participate in it personally. They represented the broader British public who had mourned the Queen's death but had not felt compelled to join the physical pilgrimage to Westminster Hall. International leaders filled the congregation at Westminster Abbey, the largest gathering of world leaders in British history. The service itself was relatively modest by royal standards, reflecting the Queen's own preferences for simplicity and dignity over ostentation. The Archbishop of Canterbury's sermon focused on the Queen's Christian faith and her understanding of leadership as service rather than power. The most poignant moment came when the last post was played, followed by 2 minutes of absolute silence. In that silence, observe across the United Kingdom and much of the Commonwealth, the full weight of what had ended became clear. The Elizabethan age was over, and with it, a connection to a time when Britain's place in the world had been very different. As the funeral service concluded, the Queen's coffin began its final journey to Windsor Castle. The route took it through the London suburbs, and then into the countryside of Berkshire, passing places where ordinary people had gathered to pay their final respects. Children waved Union Jacks, elderly veterans saluted, and thousands stood in silent tribute as the hearse passed by. At Windsor, the most private and personal ceremonies took place. The Queen was buried beside Prince Philip, her husband of 73 years, in a simple service attended only by her immediate family. The contrast between the public magnificence of the lying in state and the intimate privacy of the burial reflected the Queen's ability to balance public duty with personal feeling. The impact of the 4 days of lying in state extended far beyond the immediate aftermath of the Queen's death. The queue had created a temporary community that many participants were reluctant to abandon. Social media groups formed during the wait continued to thrive, with members sharing updates about their lives and maintaining friendships formed during those extraordinary hours of waiting. Academic researchers began studying the phenomenon almost immediately. Sociologists were fascinated by the spontaneous community formation in the queue. Political scientists analyzed the demonstration of social cohesion in an era of increasing polarization. Historians compared the Queen's lying in state to similar events throughout British history, noting both continuities and remarkable innovations. The lying in state had also demonstrated the continued relevance of physical, analog experiences in a digital age. While the entire event was extensively documented on social media and broadcast around the world, the power of the experience lay in its irreducibly personal nature. Standing in the presence of the Queen's coffin could not be replicated virtually. It required physical presence, patience, and commitment. Foreign leaders who had attended the funeral spoke repeatedly about the dignity and organization they had witnessed. President Macron of France compared it favorably to any ceremony he had witnessed in his own country. The Japanese emperor, representing one of the world's oldest monarchies, expressed admiration for the balance between tradition and accessibility that characterized the entire event. The queue had also revealed unexpected aspects of modern British society. The diversity of participants challenged stereotypes about who supported the monarchy. Young people, ethnic minorities, and working-class families had been well represented among the mourners, suggesting that respect for the Queen transcended traditional political and social divisions. The economic impact of the lying in state continued to be felt long after the funeral. Tourism to London and Windsor increased dramatically as people wanted to visit the places where these historic events had taken place. Westminster Hall and Westminster Abbey became pilgrimage destinations for people who had watched the events on television and wanted to experience the locations personally. The Queen's lying in state had also influenced discussions about the future of the monarchy. The genuine affection and respect shown by such diverse crowds suggested that the institution retained significant public support, but it also highlighted the unique personal qualities that had made Elizabeth II so effective in the role. King Charles III would need to find his own way to connect with his subjects while maintaining the dignity and accessibility that had characterized his mother's reign. The constitutional implications continued to unfold in the weeks and months following the funeral. The smooth transition from Elizabeth II to Charles III demonstrated the stability of the British system, but it also raised questions about the monarchy's future role in an increasingly democratic age. The Queen had managed to modernize the institution while preserving its essential mystery and dignity. Her successors would face the challenge of continuing that evolution. Perhaps the most lasting impact of the lying in state was its demonstration that traditional forms of respect and community could still mobilize millions of people. In an age of virtual relationships and digital communication, the queue showed that physical presence and shared experience remained powerful forces for social cohesion. The 4 days of lying in state had also created a template for how major national events might be organized in the future. The combination of ancient tradition with modern logistics, the balance between accessibility and dignity, and the integration of digital communication with physical gathering provided lessons that would influence public ceremonies for years to come. The volunteers who had managed the queue became heroes in their own right. Many had worked 18-hour shifts, helping guide mourners, providing information, and maintaining the orderly process that had impressed observers worldwide. Their dedication embodied the same spirit of service that the Queen herself had represented throughout her reign. As the months passed after the funeral, the memory of a lying in state took on an almost mythical quality. People who had participated spoke of it as a transformative experience, a moment when ordinary individuals became part of something much larger than themselves. The queue had created a temporary community bound together by shared respect and grief, demonstrating that even in an individualistic age, collective experiences could still inspire and unite. The Queen's lying in state had been her final gift to her people, an opportunity to participate personally in marking the end of an era, to come together across social and political divisions, and to demonstrate the values of patience, dignity, and mutual respect that had characterized the best of her reign. In those 4 extraordinary days, the British people had shown themselves worthy of the monarch they had lost and ready for whatever challenges lay ahead. Westminster Hall returned to its normal functions, hosting parliamentary debates and ceremonies, but it would forever be marked by those 4 days when it served as the nation's focal point for grief and gratitude. The eternal flames were extinguished, the barriers removed, and life resumed its normal rhythms. Yet something fundamental had changed. A reign of 70 years had ended, but its legacy lived on in the hearts and minds of all who had been touched by the grace, dignity, and unwavering commitment to service that Queen Elizabeth II had embodied until her final day.